Hey everybody, you guys sleepy? Because if you are, or if you aren't, regardless, I'm going to do a little reading from a vintage fishing magazine, and surely that will help you fall asleep. So, today's issue is Bassmaster Magazine, July, August 1976. And I gotta say, those are some sweet corduroy pants that gentleman's wearing. Sweet. That's kind of a sweet scene altogether. I'm kind of digging it. That is, Jesus. Look at the size of the bass. Is that for real? I thought it was an alligator head at first. Come on, something's. Really? Really? That's got to be altered. I mean, otherwise that's like a 40 pound bass. I don't know. Something ain't right. Sweet haircut too. Like, digging it. I wonder if it says who they are. Let me see. Let's see. Subscribers. Editor Bob Cobb. Where doesn't it say anything about the cover shot? Oh, cover photo. Here we go. A prize moment from Bassman Henry Daniels' logbook. See the net. I got to bring the net. Page 60. All right. Anyways, we're not going to read all. Well, editor's comments about this issue. All right. Well, let's see. Yeah. All right. Let's read. Okay. Bob Cobb is the editor of this magazine back then. Of course, Bob Cobb became like the host of the Bassmasters Fishing Show many years ago and did a fine job of it. So we're going to read editor's comments about this issue. So this is Bob Cobb, the editors. Okay. Sometimes publications get a little carried away in hanging the catch-all tag "Sure System," "Secrets of the Pros," "Surefire Method," etc. on a how-to article. Often, it's just a cosmetic label. Yeah, I'll say. There's no sure system ever. Never, ever a sure system. "Secrets of the Pros," "Surefire Method." Dangerous words, but they catch a lot of you people out there. That's for sure. That's why I'm not going to be using okay, never mind. I might use those cheap words that draw in the click someday, but so far I really kind of stay away from that. Just tell like it is. Anyhow, such isn't the case with Sure System for finding the best depth for bass. A two-part how-to feature prepared by Iowa Bassmaster Rick Taylor, who made some waves in the bass think tank in recent issues with solid facts on predicting spring lunker days and tactics for stream fishing. Just for a moment, suppose that at the onset of every bassin' trip, the good bass fairy popped out of your live well or tackle box and offered to answer one and only one question for that day's fishing. Assuming such a fantasy could happen, what question would you ask? Oh, so you get a bass fairy in your boat, and you get to ask it one question. I like this. The question that I would ask my bass fairy. Wow. I guess it would depend on the situation, but well. This was in 1976, but if I was to ask the bass fairy, gosh, it totally depends. Because in some situations, I'd ask the bass fairy, give me the best GPS coordinates where the biggest school, the biggest fish are in the lake. But a lot of times the fish aren't schooled, and you got to pick them off one here, one there. So that would be a different question. So if the fish are grouped up, I would ask, give me the GPS coordinates. Please, Mr. or Mrs. Bass Fairy, please give me the GPS coordinates for the biggest school of biggest bass in the entire lake. Now, if they're not schooled, then I would ask, Mr. or Mrs. Bass Fairy, could you please, please tell me the depth that I ought to be fishing. That would be the next question. Because it's one thing to pick them off one at a time when you're pounding the bank, but it's an entirely different type of fishing when you're picking off one at a time when you're fishing deeper. So, back to Bob Cobb's editorial. Okay? All right. Okay, the last thing he said was, assuming such a fantasy could happen, what question would you ask? And continuing on here, now we go. Chances are it would be, what's the best depth to find the bass today? I mean, that is a good question. The magic depth is the key to finding bass. It's the first piece in the bassin puzzle that pro Bassmasters seek to find when reaching a tournament lake. The answer to that question alone can have more to do with your bass fishing success than any hot new lure, exotic lure color, or can't miss system. Bassmaster Taylor's two-part report is a most easily grasped explanation of what could be a most difficult subject. Today's scientific fishing can swamp your think tank quickly. Wow, they're using the term think tank back in 1976. I like that. Taylor's detailed but easy reading review of facts about water temperature and oxygen effects on bass and what bass desire in each doesn't leave you floundering in a sea of oxygen inversions, thermal climbs, and light intensity factors. Bob Cobb, you're hitting a home run here. Then, in part 2, you use this data to zero in on the bass's best summertime depth. This system will work for you, and it's related in such a down-to-the-boat seat level with charts and tables that you can't miss. Don't be turned off by the term sure system. There's more than a book cover title here. The growth of man-made reservoirs has generated thousands of acres of new bass fishing territory. However, many northern national lakes offer tremendous bass catching opportunities. Bill Linder is quoted in this. I love it. For those of you who don't know, I worked for 9 years. I worked side by side with Bill Linder, and I loved every moment of it. And I can credit Bill Linder with shaping who I am today for the better. Love Bill Linder. Don't see or talk to him near as enough as I should. Okay, Bill Linder, the nephew of one of the Midwest's best-known anglers, Al Linder, details how to fish these natural lakes and summer patterns for bass on natural lakes. Bill's first article in Bassmaster is a keeper. As a longtime pupil of Uncle Al, Bill Linder has profited in his angling education. You can benefit too. You know we're going to be reading that article. The plastic worm is acclaimed as the best lure ever for fooling bass. Few argue the fact, but some anglers still shy away from this lure. This issue covers a pastel on worm fishing. There's a new innovation we've termed gurgle worms that breathe and are said to be 8 times noisier than conventional plastic worms. The gurgle worm. I think the gurgle worm is kind of faded into the background, but in this issue of Bassmaster holds the secrets, the gurgle worm. And of those of you that have this issue can find out what it is, because I'm not going to read about it and tell you guys. I'm keeping the gurgle worm under wraps and keeping it to myself. Okay. Where I left off in the middle of this paragraph. This may be the answer for the worm-shy Bassmaster who lacks patience to develop the necessary feel for worming. These disc-shaped wigglers squirm in your wet hand. Jim McKay, winner of the 1976 Louisiana Invitational, says, bass hit this new type worm like a crankbait. They won't let go. Bass bite and they won't let go. That's my own little addition. The Berkeley slogan, Bass Bite Won't Let Go. Summer can spell trouble for Bassmasters. The bright sky and clear water means trouble in Lockjaw City. Texas Bassmaster Morris Gresham has the answer. Mini worms. Gresham and a couple of bassin buddies proved it to their satisfaction that discovering the slim diameter worms did trigger sluggish bass, and didn't reveal that fact to another friend who stuck to his old tired method of worm fishing. Finally, Grisham and company let the word out, and the scaled down worms worked for the bass buddy, who was almost at the string's end. Now, if we can explain that cute blonde bass fairy in the live well when we get home, this issue should keep your summer from being a bummer. The cute blonde bass fairy in your boat. Oh, that is too funny. All right, well, I think I actually got one of these crankbaits right there in Fire Tiger. The Big Jim. All right, how do I get the Bill Linder's article? That's what we're doing, without a doubt. Summer Patterns for Natural Lakes, Bill Linder, page 28. That will be our feature article for this episode of Falling Asleep to Jim Moynagh reading from Vintage Fishing Magazines. 28. Oh, that's just the gems. I love this. I love reading these old magazines. Okay, there we go. There's our lead-in photo. Sweetness. I don't know who's in that photo. There's a bunch of words there. I guess I'll have to read those. Some pine trees. Way to go, Bill. Way to go. All right, here's what it says in the blue lettering on the photo. Veteran northern bassmen search out the area where the meads stop growing. This pivot point, the word blends into the pine needles. This pivot point of weed edge is always the key to summer bass location. During summer, northern largemouth bass settle into a fairly predictable fish-producing pattern. First, you must find the fish. Here's how. Okay, I agree. That weed edge is very... I agree, Bill. I agree. First of all, let's see how many pages we're getting into. How many pages did you write, Billy? Oh, boy. Oh, my God, this is a long one. This is a long... Try this two-handed casting grip. No. Oh, my God, now I gotta go all the way to page 76. I don't know if we got time for all this. Oh, my gosh. 76. How many more pages? Oh, yeah, okay. Well, oh man, this is going to take a long time. You guys got time for this? Maybe you're already asleep and you won't hear the rest of this. If you're not asleep yet, I think you will be shortly. Okay. America's favorite freshwater game fish is the largemouth black bass. Excuse me one moment while I unplug the dehumidifier. Alright. Gosh, I hope that wasn't too annoying. I don't know what it sounds like on video. But if it was annoying, right now I got nobody listening to this video or watching it. So anyways, back to it. America's favorite freshwater game fish is the largemouth black bass. More man hours are spent in pursuit of old Micropterus salmoides. That would be the Latin name as given to the largemouth bass by taxonomists than many other species combined. The largemouth bass is found in every state of the Union except Alaska. And as the nation's most popular sport fish, I wouldn't be surprised if it finds a place in America's bicentennial celebration. Now, how many of you were alive during America's bicentennial? Me. and I remember watching the fireworks. I was sitting there. They were down at Hanson. There were some fireworks. I think it was Hanson Park, New Brighton, Minnesota. And I remember standing like on a staircase next to, I think it was Bel Air. That doesn't make sense. I was going to say Bel Air Elementary, which is not where I went, but that wouldn't make sense. I don't know. I don't know. Never mind. Back to this. To be a successful Bassmaster, you have to understand the fish's basic nature, be able to locate them, and select a presentation that will make the fish bite or strike. My Uncle Al Linder has a formula for fishing. F plus L plus P equals success. Now, this sounds simple, but it really takes time and experience to master. In L's formula, F means knowing the basic nature of the species of fish being pursued. So F means fish. The L means locating the fish. L means location. And P means presenting the best fish catching method for that particular situation. P, presentation. And then equals S, success. Actually, that's a beautiful formula. Absolutely beautiful. It is really never forget that formula, because those are exactly the elements you got to find. You understand the fish, its habits, its behavior, understand its location, why it's at that location, when it'll be at that location, and then the best way to catch it. I mean, a surefire system. Okay. The correct values for each factor adds up to success. Al Linder, a regular on the Pro Bass Tournament Trail, applies this reasoning to all of his angling, no matter where he goes or what kind of fish he is seeking. Al's formula was running through my mind last September, soon after he telephoned me. Billy, he said, I have a few things to finish up at the office before I can leave. I want you to take out a couple of guys in the morning, put them on some bass. Sure, Al, I said. Who are the guys? Spence Petros, managing editor of Fishing Facts, and Ray Scott, president of Bass Anglers Sportsman Society. I don't ever remember Billy telling me about this trip. I wonder if he actually did it. Al said it as casually as that, too. Now, I grew up all around fishing, and when you're 17 years old, you tend to think you know just about everything. You're just busting with confidence. But to pull a trip with these names, I found I had a bit of a lump in my throat. I kept thinking, what am I going to do? I hadn't been on the water for more than a week, and I didn't have the current pattern of movement for bass. But I was determined to give a decent account of myself. I learned that Spence Petros and Ray Scott had come to Brainerd, Minnesota to do a smallmouth bass film on the Canadian border with Al for his television show. Since Al had to make some last-minute preparations, Spence and Ray had about 3.5 hours to kill. And how else can these guys kill time except to go fishing? Now, I'm sure to Spence Petros and Ray Scott, our brief bass fishing foray was no big deal. But to me, it was. I kept mulling over Al's formula for angling success and tried to make a decision. Should we fish deep or shallow? Should we fish the reeds or the drop-offs? Since we were only going to be on the water for a few hours, I decided to play the odds and shoot my best game for the drop-offs. I felt that this was what I knew best. Back in that day, I would have shot shallow. But that's because that's what I knew best back then. Well, we didn't exactly murder the fish that day, but I did manage to put 6 nice bass in the boat, and we had a number of pickups and sufficient satisfying action in the 2.5 to 3 pound hours. 2.5 to 3 hours we fished. The drop-off tactics we used that day will locate and catch largemouth on the average natural northern lake during summer and post-summer patterns. Generally, I'm going to be discussing how we fish bass lakes in the upper Midwest. Most are found from the Dakotas on the west through Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and to New England, and as far south on a line with Iowa, Illinois, and New Jersey. These lakes range in size from 50 to more than 10,000 acres. Each is different in shape, bottom structure, weed growth, depth, availability of forage, water color, fertility, and a host of other factors. But what they all have in common is the largemouth bass as their dominant species. Keep in mind that I'm talking about bass in summer and post-summer patterns. In spring and fall, their patterns of movement are quite different. After the bass spawn in shallow bays, canals, and sheltered shorelines, they move into slightly deeper water. Then they settle down into a fairly predictable location pattern. They will select structured locations that drop off into deep water, usually over 25 feet if available. Most of the fish will tend to school up in deep water and move shallower to feed at specific times. I have found bass over many different types of bottom conditions, but natural lakes always seek the deep edges of weeds beds first. Bass thrive in fertile water, water with considerable underwater weed growth. This offers cover and usually abundant forage fish. On just about all of these type bass lakes, the main type of cover bass we relate to is weeds growing on drop-offs in heavy, bold print right there. So here's, now let's see what this drawing is. Typical bass cover natural lakes. Okay, so we got outside edge of weed line, area of heavy weed growth, cabbage, lily pad. It's just, I'm sorry. It's kind of a hard one to see there. I don't know how this is adding anything at the moment, but anyways, okay, figure 1 is these weeds. Okay, let me see what it says. Learn to locate these two types of weeds in northern lakes. In most cases, largemouth bass will use kambamba or cabbage in the summer at depths of 4 to 20 feet of water. The broadleaf cabbage is commonly called bass weeds. Does that tell you anything about where to find largemouths? Okay, kambamba. I don't. Kambamba. Okay, I'll just. Kambamba is spelled Cabomba, and just look that up if you wish. I'm not going any further. But remember, this is 1976, and Bill Lender was, what did he say, like 18 at the time? 17 or 18? So, anyways, I'll be looking for that kambamba. I still am looking for that kambamba. Still am. All right. The best kind of weed is to locate the broadleaf cabbage. See figure 1. Now, this is before Eurasian water milfoil came into many of our natural lakes. And there's no mention of coontail here. Now, coontail is a native plant, but the Eurasian water milfoil isn't. And in this picture, actually, that looks like northern water milfoil to me, right? Which is a natural plant to Minnesota and much of the North Country. So he's calling the northern water milfoil kambamba, and that is a good plant. Coontail is also another one, but Eurasian water milfoil is that. If you have that in the lake, that is a key place to check. The fish could be on the edge of it, but they also could be inside it. So very key. Cabbage, in my mind, cabbage is like the third. I mean, some lakes that's all they have, so that's where you look. But I put probably Eurasian milfoil 1, then 2 maybe coontail, heavy coontail beds, not just short carpet of it on the bottom, but it has to be like tall stands of it, 2. But if you don't have that, then maybe maybe cabbage or the kambamba. That's the other thing is cabbage can start right in the spring growing tall. So, I mean, boy, that's interesting. Eurasian water milfoil 1, coontail would have to be eventually later in the year after it's had a good chance to develop. Coontail comes into play late in the year for sure, probably as number 2 or maybe number 1. And in lakes that are absence of those first 2, then cabbage might be number 1 for quite a bit of the time. But you also, what other deep weed is there? Oh, there's also the, what's that others? Well, you have those deep grassy kind of weeds. Yeah, those generally are behind cat. Those I put lower on the list typically because most commonly they're like they grow in softer bottoms. Cabbage can grow on a softer bottom, but also it can handle some of the harder bottoms. But some of these grassy weeds like are almost strictly soft bottom weeds, so they kind of rate lower. And then there's a big one I'm missing right now. Oh, yeah, okay, we have something called curly leaf cabbage, and that's that heavy growth stuff right away in the spring. I mean, let's say the ice goes off. Let's say it goes off April 20th. Well, by May 20th, this stuff is like carpeting many of the lakes. Not all the lakes. Not every lake has this stuff, but I know like a lot of the lakes around the metropolitan area in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and that you get this, and it tends to be in more fertile lakes for some reason. But you get that curly leaf cabbage, and that's typically a soft bottom weed too. So it's not as good as the other cabbage that he's talking about here. And that curly leaf cabbage, as many that by mid-July it's like died off. All right. Anyways, enough of that. Gosh, we're never gonna get done with this if I keep going down these side roads. Okay. All right, the best kind of weed is to locate the broadleaf cabbage. They are thick stem weeds which resemble tobacco plants. They are commonly called bass weeds or in some areas red tops because of the reddish kernel-like bud that often protrudes from the water. Yeah, it makes like a little red top. Sticks right out of the water. And one interesting thing about those red tops is early in the year when there's a lot of dragonflies, those dragonflies like to land on those red tops, and I believe a lot of sunfish know that, and they are waiting for those dragonflies to come by and pick them off those red tops. I've actually seen that. So, kabamba, another excellent bass holding weed, is shorter and tends to mushroom out. Wherever you find cabbage and kabamba growing together, you usually have an excellent potential bass hotspot. These plants supply oxygen and cover for both bass and their prey. Both grow deep, often from 4 to as much as 20 feet of water. The depth at which they stop growing depends on the clarity of the water, but the fertility of the water and the bottom content also are factors. In any case, there always is an area where these weeds stop growing. This is what we call the major break line or pivot point in bass lakes of this type. I think it's the deep weed line is probably today's most commonly used term to reference that. This weed edge always in all caps, is the key to summer bass location. Always. It's hard to use. I don't like using the term always in bass fishing or any kind of fishing, but many types of lakes, it is the key for the big, especially the bigger ones. Your goal should be to locate this type of weedy drop-off on a bar with good bottom structure. This could be a flat point, a sunken island, or just a projection from the regular shoreline drop-off. Any weedy drop-off that is somehow different from the surrounding area should be carefully checked. Some weedy patches are so extensive that often only a minor protrusion in the outer edge of the weeds can be the sole holding point for a school of bass in that area, especially if it is accessible to deep water. Almost always, sunken weed islands are productive summertime bass sites. The points, turns, and bends on these islands are the locations to fish. Sometimes you might discover a saddle. This is where a sunken weed island comes near a weedy point or shoreline drop-off. It forms a saddle-like structure with a trench between the two. Usually, this site is a sure bet for summer bass, wherever you might find one. Let me tell you something, saddles are absolutely, they are a magnet, okay? A saddle at the right depth. The perfect saddle to me is one, so you got a weed structure here, a big weed structure here with a tapering point that comes down, and it goes deeper than the weed line by just a few feet. And you got maybe a little rock on there, and then that runs for a little ways, and then all of a sudden it comes up to another piece of weedy structure over here. So you got the weedy structure here, tapering down to a point, and then it's connected by the saddle to another point, underwater point, and then that tapers up into a big weed flat here. That saddle is hot stuff. Bill Linder is dead on with that right here. Okay. Oh, and he's got a picture of it. All right, we'll get to this. All right, we'll cover these pictures and drawings here. All right. There are a number of ways to find the right bass structure. A hydrographic map showing the lake's bottom contours will save you a lot of time, especially when fishing a new lake. But finding out where the weeds are, what kind of weeds they are, and how deep they grow should be your first concern. Pick out the points and islands that appear good and probe them until you find the right type of weeds near deep water. And that's another point. It is, when he said, okay, deep water is important. So now if you have a big weed flat that tapers into, like for example, that saddle, you want a deep cut coming up against that saddle, okay? You don't want it to just be like a flat, barely transitioning, slow transition. Unless if you have to take that considering where you are fishing. Generally, in northern natural lakes. See, what popped in my head was the Florida lakes and how flat they are, so any sort of little change in contour can be good. But seeing as how we're talking about northern natural lakes, yeah, you want more dramatic type drop-offs and structure changes, and that tight drop-off to one of these saddles or one of these underwater points. That's preferred over a gradual run into it from the basin. Okay. Pick out the points and islands that appear good and probe them until you find the right type of weeds near deep water. Another method, which works well on smaller lakes, is to locate the edge of the weeds and speed troll a deep diving plug, such as a bomber, spoon plug, big O, balsa bee, etc., along the edge of the weeds, holding a consistent depth level. Holding a specific depth can be done quite accurately with some experience and a sonar depth finder. The device will enable you to cover the shoreline drop-off and spot any points or projections along your trolling run. With this method, you can often take a lot of northern pike as well as bass. Speed trolling also will tell you very quickly how thick the weeds are, the varieties, and depth. I'll never forget the first time I went on a work trip with Bill. We went down to Florida, and we went to this Florida natural lake that I don't think he had been there. I certainly hadn't been there because I was still in college. And what did he do? Then this would have been probably 86 maybe, somewhere right in there, 86, 87. And what did he do? He did exactly that. He cracked out some, at the time of this article, they didn't have Rapala shad wraps, but he cracked out some shad wraps. He tied one on, I tied one on mine, and that's how he explored the weed lines in that Florida lake we're on. I remember catching some big chain pickerel that day. We might have caught a bass or two, but the chains were like, they were hot on fire that day. Okay, let's show you these. Let's go over these pictures and captions. Okay, this first picture. Okay, there's a nice limit of fish. And guess who that is? That is Al Linder and his son Jim Linder. Or no, is Al Linder and his nephew Jim Linder. Sorry. And the caption reads, a 2-man limit of northern largemouth in central Minnesota can average over 2 pounds. Well-known Bassmaster Al Linder and nephew Jim Linder fished a 200-foot-long cabbage bank on Minnesota's Long Lake to boat 8 of the dozen bass shown. A 5-pounder this far north is about top of the line. Biggest here weighed 4.5 pounds. In the southern part of Minnesota, 6-pound largemouth are more common. Yeah, nice catch there. Nice catch. Look at that. I mean, here, these guys are, Al and Jimmy are still prominent in the fish education world. You can, what's their show? Linder's Angling Edge. Al and Jimmy are still on there all the time. But here's what they looked like back in this issue, 1976. I just love it. I love it. All right, then. Okay, now here's Bill's drawing of a saddle. Okay. There's the saddle. Okay. I'll read the caption. I'm telling you, saddles are the deal. Not every lake has them. The lakes that do often only have a few. To be consistent in catching bass in northern natural lakes, a Bassmaster must be aware of various movements of fish within and along the weed beds and weed lines, and alter your lure presentation accordingly. Depending on the feeding attitudes of the bass, negative, neutral, or positive, shown are possible patterns that could occur in a saddle fishing situation on a northern natural lake. Okay, let me see what he's got. Thick cabbage could hold most fish in this area, so that's right on top of that hump. Watch for thickest cabbage. Watch for projection points of cabbage. Okay. All right, yeah, well, so basically, if you want to see that again, there it is. But this is the point. This is what we're referring to as a saddle in this picture. Would be, so you got this point right here, and it saddles over to this other piece of structure here. Okay, that there's like a connection right here. It's deep over here. It's deep up here. But this connects the two, and it's absent of weeds. And if there's rock on that connection, you can look for walleyes, smallmouth, largemouth, other sunfish in the summertime. That's just a good magnet for fish. Muskie, definitely muskie. Everything likes those saddles, especially if it's a rock saddle, or hard gravel saddle even. Okay, so we'd already gone to the next page. All right, to locate sunken islands, many of which are not indicated on maps. Okay, remember, this is 1976, and that was a true statement in 1976. Back in those days, or even up until the pre-mapping era, I would spend tons of time just running parallel runs back and forth, shoreline to shoreline, across sections of the lake, trying to find contours, trying to find structure that was not, printed on commercial maps or DNR maps and so forth. And if you find one of those places, not many people knew about it, so oftentimes in a tournament you'd have it to yourself. Okay, to locate sunken islands, many of which are not indicated on maps, run across the lake in a systematic crisscross pattern with your depth finder turned on full gain. Run until you find a rise or significant change in the bottom structure. Even today, it is hard to find structure that is not on mapping chips, but there's still a few out there. So even when you're running across a lake, I always keep one eye on your depth finder, because you never know what you might run across. Run until you find a significant change in the bottom structure. Make a note of it and its location. On smaller bodies of water, you can read the bottom quickly and efficiently in a very short time. Using this method, you can discover the small knolls, humps, and points that other anglers pass over without realizing what they missed. Many depth finders come with a transducer bracket that is not suitable for taking high-speed readings. A solid mounting bracket will not kick up from water pressure at fast speeds. If you are a serious bass angler, you should rig your transducer so that you get accurate readings even at high speed. Absolutely. If you locate areas of boulders, rock, or gravel among the weeds, these areas often are fish magnets. Nothing has changed since 1976. Rocks and gravel mixed into a weed bed. Ka-ching, ka-ching. You mainly find such sites by feel, using bottom-bouncing lures as a jig and minnow, and slip sinker or power head rigged worms. The same holds true for brush piles, man-made cribs, logs, or anything else that is different than the surrounding bottom conditions. Remember, that is the little structural changes that are attractive for bass along these weed lines. Many natural bass lakes contain bulrushes or reeds. These weeds also attract bass under certain conditions. This type weeds grow in shallow water, but bass will move into this area in mornings and evenings. Often, bass move into reeds during midday to feed, providing the weather and bottom conditions are right. Many times, bass producing weed beds can be found near these reeds, especially if they form a point or grow on top of a sunken island. When you know a bed of reeds, check out the deeper break line adjacent to it. If there are good weeds on the drop-off, bass most likely will use this area from time to time. Some of my best bass action has resulted on the sharper breaks, those quick drops on the edge of the weeds. Why didn't you mean the reeds? Anyways, it says weeds. Some other excellent producing areas, however, are a slow tapering edge that, from the edge of the weeds, runs like a flat for a distance. These areas are not unrewarding, especially if these are the only break lines in the lake. Smaller lakes often have weeds all along the edge of the drop-off with one or two deep holes. These holes will contain most of the bass, especially if there's a hard bottom with good weed growth on the drop-offs. This is, however, not the only kind of hole that will hold bass. Some large bodies of water have vast, flat areas of sand no deeper than 10 feet with deep holes dropping to 45 feet deep that attract schools of bigger bass. Fish use the weedy points running along the edge of these holes. Remember, hard bottom and weed growth are the keys to locating largemouth in northern natural lakes. That is so true. Hard bottom and weed growth. If they're not actually in the weeds with the hard bottom, they'll be on the edge. It's so true. Nothing's changed since 1976. Before settlers even settled Minnesota, the fish were probably doing this exact thing. The best way to find out if there's a bass in a weed bed is to fish it. Your main objective is to find out how deep the bass are. Sometimes bass hold on the inside edge of the cabbage weeds. This normally occurs under ideal fishing conditions when the weather is warm and many days have passed since the last serious cold front. The fish are prompted to move way up on the shallower portions of the food shelf and are actively feeding. At times, usually under more adverse weather conditions, bass are found in the deepest weeds. Following cold fronts, more bass concentrate along the outside edge of the weeds, and in many cases deeper. Usually the bass are less active but will school together. Okay, now I'll edit to that, or I'll put in my 2 cents on that. After adverse conditions, after a cold front, the bass will move into the thickest weeds, okay? They won't be far from the drop. Typically, it'll be the thickest weeds. So if you can find a heavy stand of weeds right with hard bottom, right along a drop-off, that you want to actually fish in those weeds. Now, when conditions are more favorable, sometimes they'll loosen up and they'll get to the outside. They'll be more on the outside where it's less dense, and they can move up on the flat a little bit too. But there's so many variables, though. It's hard to make firm generalities. But just think, if you got a harsh, hard sun, just imagine the heaviest shade you can find in that weed bed. And hopefully that heaviest shade is, the closer that heaviest shade is to the weed line, the better. Now we're talking, I'm not talking during the spawn. I'm talking, once the fish are done spawning and have moved out of their spawning areas. Okay. All right. Where was I? We went, here's some diagrams on this page. Illustrated is a saddle situation. More saddle stuff. Okay, we kind of went over that. A hotspot usually differs from its immediate surroundings. A small rock pile jutting out from an underwater point is a likely fish magnet. A perfect way to say it, Bill, right there. That's that picture. You got this underwater point, and on one part of it you got a rock cluster. Yeah, look, that's your key right there. Most of the time when you fish this area, you're going to find them there. And this top one says the weed line's down. Okay, it just talks about the weed line. All right. You know, in dingy water, the weed line's shallower. Clear water, it's deeper. It's all dependent upon the light penetration. Oh, those are some classic photos there. Who's that guy? Marvin Baker, Broadus, Texas. Woo Daves. Oh my God, he looks like a little kid in that picture. Basil Bacon, Jimmy Houston. Wow. Okay. Actively feeding fish are the exception rather than the rule. True. Most of the time, the fish aren't suicidal. Most of the time, largemouths, you got to coerce them a little bit. You know, only under ideal weather conditions are the fish literally suicidal, but meaning that they'll run down a lure from a great distance. A lot of times you got to spoon feed them. Okay. Actively feeding fish are the exception rather than the rule, yet there are always some catchable fish on those weedy food shelves, whether they are on the outside edge, the inside edge, or the heavy clumps in between. To be consistently successful, a Bassmaster should be aware of various movements of fish within and along the weeds so to alter your presentation accordingly. Most bass congregate in the thickest patch of cabbage weeds available. Absolutely. As long as there's not Eurasian water milfoil or like massive heavy stands of coontail. I agree. The thicker, the more bass seem to prefer this cover, especially in heavy sunshine. You can pick out the thicker patch targets by noting the number of kernel-like buds protruding above the surface on calm days. Okay, cabbage is not always topped out like red tops. Not always, okay? So a lot of times it's just a matter of having to just explore these weed beds and just visually just see, you know, with your eyes. In clear water you can see the cabbage and you can see how thick it is. Okay, whatever the case, it's best to begin at the edge of the weeds, the pivot point, and work shallower, then deeper in that order. The business of proper lure presentation is very complex, but the combination of little things carried out correctly is the key to successful bassing. There are many aspects such as depth control, speed control, lure choice, boat control, and the ability to recognize a pattern that will make or break any fishing trip. A very, very important presentation consideration is boat control. The way that you position and operate your craft along weed beds can mean the difference between finding fish or not finding them. There are many unsuitable boat landings in this area for heavy bass rigs. When I can't launch our Ranger bass boat, I use a smaller fiberglass tri-hull powered by a 25 horsepower Evinrude. This is an ideal rig for fishing smaller northern lakes. You can maneuver very quickly and maintain complete control of the boat even in strong winds. With this rig, you can virtually remain stationary near a school of bass without anchoring simply by shifting the motor from reverse to neutral. These smaller boats are easily launched from poor boat ramps in shallow water that are encountered on many northern lakes. On casting runs, I operate the boat in reverse and preferably move along a bar into the wind. See, he's talking about fishing without a trolling motor, just using your tiller to drive outboard. On casting runs, I operate the boat in reverse and preferably move along a bar into the wind. So he's, from what I understand, he is moving backwards with his boat, with the motor in reverse. I begin fishing by holding the boat a few feet deeper than the edge of the weeds and casting up into the weed bed. It's important to hold the boat position deeper than the edge of the weeds because this pivot point will usually be where the bass are located. By working the bar parallel to the edge of the weeds, you can cover the break line thoroughly. If necessary, slip the motor in neutral to drift back over points or back into position to cast to schools of bass. When the depth finder indicates you're getting too shallow, engage the motor and move out deeper. On some occasions, you might place the boat shallower than the edge of the weeds and cast to deeper water, working the lure up the drop off. Up the drop off. This, however, is a seldom used exception rather than the rule. Use this method, for example, in reservoirs where you find bass facing out toward deeper water, and it seems best to cast to them by working a lure up the drop-off. From scuba diving experience, I've noticed a similar pattern with bass in weeds. Scuba diving with Bill Ender is an experience. That's all I got to say. Love that guy. Love this guy. I love Bill Ender. Sometimes they're motionless with heads pointed down, almost buried in thick clumps of weeds. I've swam right up to the fish. Apparently, these bass were inactive and just resting. At times, bass were obviously more active and would quickly move away whenever I approached. On a weed line, the more active fish would usually be facing deep water. Keep in mind that changing to a deep to shallow retrieve might be best when you feel the fish are down there, but you can't seem to trigger their strike button by conventional casting or retrieving methods. The plastic worm and its variations gets the vote here as the most effective all-around lure for bass fishing in the weeds. It certainly is ideal bait for fishing weedy drop-offs. Plastic worms, they're tough to beat. Of course, we got different rigging methods on them now, but they still work on the weeds, no doubt. There are two proven ways to rig a worm for ripping through the weeds. The Texas slip rig worm and the swimming jig and worm with exposed hook. So he's basically talking about a Texas rig and basically like a jig worm, or what's now, a jig worm or a Ned rig. Both are deadly in natural lakes. Plastic worms for fishing northern lakes usually vary in length from 4 to 7 1/4 inches. Above all, they should have a high flotation factor and medium soft texture so the slip rigged hook won't penetrate too easily when dragged through weeds, and have a wide active tail. The swimming jig head is dressed with Mr. Twister tails, Sensations, Reaper bodies, or other high flotation worms. These are the types of worm designs with an instant swimming action built in. A swimming jig and worm is at times more effective than a slip rig worm, particularly fishing in high winds. I'm not sure why that is, but in high winds. Maybe because you're swimming it in high winds, the fish are going to have a bigger strike zone. They're going to swim farther to get your bait, so it makes sense. Sinker weight, line diameter, hook size, worm length, and drop speed are things the plastic worm angler must consider. The popular Texas slip rig worm is almost totally weedless, consisting of a hook, a bullet, or a cone-shaped slip sinker, and the worm itself. The slip sinker size is governed by the depth you are fishing, thickness of weed cover, and the rate at which you want the lure to drop. Hook size is directly related to the size of the worm. Basically, a 1/0 or 2/0 Sprode hook is compatible with 4 to 6 inch worms, while a 3 or even 4/0 can be used with larger 7 1/4 to 8 inch worms. Yeah, I usually like to, this is how I pick out a worm hook. When I have it Texas rigged, when I rig that worm Texas rigged, I want the gap, the remaining exposed gap of the hook gap that's not buried in the worm. I want that gap to be at a minimum at least the thickness of the worm itself. Okay, so if the thickness of the worm is X, then the gap of the worm and the hook gap is 2X. When working weeds in natural northern lakes, I've concluded that 10-pound test is both the minimum and maximum line needs. I think that school of thinking has changed. More bass are lost in weeds on 8-pound than 10-pound test. You may get more strikes, but you lose big fish setting the hook with lighter line since it is more difficult to drive the hook home. With 10-pound test line, you'll find you can rip out most any variety of weeds, except reeds, and lead most bass out into open water. We did skip over these illustrations, and we'll just skip over those. Okay. I personally like lines with a little added visibility, such as clear blue strength. You can detect a twitch or movement in the line signaling a strike even before you actually feel it. Bass are notorious for grabbing the bait on the fall and swimming towards you after engulfing it. Being able to see the line makes a big difference in worm fishing. Absolutely. Worm fishermen have always been line watchers. Always. And actually, I think just about any lure you fish, you watch the line to some level, but especially, in Carolina rigging, shaky heading, Texas rigging, flipping, pitching, that line watching is pretty important. After casting, watch the line and allow the worm to settle the bottom. Then, begin working it through the weeds by raising the rod tip to move the worm. Now drop the rod tip and immediately reel in the slack. Work the worm with the rod. Don't just reel it in. With this retrieve, you will have more control and better feel of the worm. Make certain to retrieve the worm several feet past the edge of the weeds. Bass will often lay on the outside edge. And the outside edge on days where it's, after you've had days of stable hot weather, it seems like that outside edge plays a bigger factor. Okay. Now where was I? You will feel only a slight twitch, tap, or bump as the fish takes the worm. React quickly once a bass takes the lure. You should pause only long enough to drop the rod tip toward the water and take up slack in the line. This is essential to set the hook properly. Then set the hook hard and fast. In my experience, it's best to set the hook at least twice and many times 3 times on a good fish just to make certain. Remember, you not only have to drive that hook through the slip rig plastic worm, but also into the bass's bony jaw. At the first indication of a strike, make a mental note of the depth and type of area the fish was in. If it occurs far from shore and away from easy reference points, throw out a buoy marker. Try to establish a pattern as to where the fish are in relation to your boat, and cast back to the same spot to determine if a school or several bass are present. Noting these key details will aid you later in locating fish at other similar areas. After establishing the daily pattern, you won't waste casts, but you'll be able to drop your lure in the fish zone more than just random casting. For example, if you discover the only bass hitting are strikes near the boat, assume the fish are holding deeper than or right at the weed line. Then, either adjust the cast to be shorter than normal or move the boat a little deeper away from the spot. Little refinements like these save you fishing time and result in you catching more bass. Little refinements. Bass fishing is all about little refinements. Being successful at bass fishing, being successful in bass tournaments is all about little refinements. I've often been asked what's the most important thing to know in tournament fishing, and I said, and that my reply is, it's an accumulation of many, many, many small details that are addressed and accurately analyzed that make up a successful day on the water. Many little details. The knots you tie, how strong, do you tie it properly? Do you wet your line when you cinch that knot up? Are you holding the fish too close to the fish? Are you holding it too far from the fish? Are you reeling fast enough? Or are you reeling too fast? Just many little details add up to be a successful tournament angler. Many little details. And it's attention to these details. And you can skip over some of them, and at some point it'll bite you. It'll cost you a fish. Okay, it's important to observe the retrieve used when a fish hits. This establishes a retrieve pattern. Sometimes bass want a worm hopping quickly. Other times they prefer it resting almost motionless on the bottom. Also vary the worm colors until a successful color pattern is discovered. Color selection, in my opinion, is a trial and error thing. Some days it makes no difference. On other days it seems to make all the difference in catching bass. As your angling results begin to score, you should piece together an entire pattern of presentation for that day. There are days when you will take only a few scattered fish, and on these, a wide variety of lures and methods. It becomes apparent you can't set any pattern. Don't be discouraged. That's the facts of life in bass fishing. There's yet a different method for presentation of the swimming jig and worm. The wide, flat jig head with a twister type grub or swimming tail produces a slow falling action that's enticing and very lifelike. With the exposed hook, it's easier to hook a bass, but with the jig and worm, you literally have to rip through the weeds. When bass want a fast-moving swimming worm where conditions permit, this jig and worm combination can work wonders. All right, let me just... maybe I should show you this illustration. Okay, this is the illustration of the Texas rig, and then the swimming jig that he's talking about, the swim jig worm or whatever. Okay, and the caption of this says, the popular slip rig plastic worm works well for fishing weeds, but at times a swimming retrieve with a flat-headed jig and twister type worm is the ticket on northern bass. The reverse eye design of the Lindy Sherlock hook top holds the worm up on the hook. Note the line tie to the front of the jig for swimming the bait. Got it. Okay. No, god damn, now where was I? Dang it. All right. There's yet a different method for presentation of the swimming jig and worm. The wide flat jig head with a twister type or swimming tail produces a slow falling action that's enticing and very lifelike. Okay, all right, we did all that. Okay, here we go. This type lure is best worked with pumping sweeps of the rod. Bass will hit on the drop when the bait plummets toward bottom after a broad sweep of your rod. You may need to experiment with this retrieve to discover the correct motion. Methods used in slip rig. That's the water pump. Methods used in slip rig worm fishing can be applied to a jig and worm fishing. And once again, let's remind you to watch for those little things that add up to a big difference. Use of live minnows on the standard or weedless jig head is very similar to fishing with the jig and worm. The addition of the live bait is usually excellent for weed line fishing, especially under tough frontal conditions in deeper water. Best minnow to use, in my opinion, is the red-tailed chub. I think that's still the same. I'm not a live bait fisherman, but the live bait fishermen I know, they hail the praises of the red-tailed chub. They're tough and stay on the hook for repeated casts. Live bait should not be overlooked in natural northern lakes. Bass love live minnows and take this rig aggressively. When bass are finicky or not feeding actively, the jig and minnow rig can be your trump card in the hole. You will also have a bonus chance of taking walleyes or northern pike. Other strictly live bait presentations which work well in northern waters include leeches, salamanders, crayfish, hellgrammites, mud and shiner minnows, night crawlers, and frogs. I've seen some of these live baits tear heck out of the bass when artificials produce little or nothing. This is especially true on heavily pressured lakes, those pounded by experienced fishermen. Bass get more and more conditioned to artificial lures, especially the bigger prize bass. It's my belief that bass can and do become conditioned to the constant presentations of plastic worms, crankbaits, and spinners. This is where live bait comes to the front and will outproduce, page 76, they'll outproduce, this is agonizing, I want to know what they outproduce. Artificials, hands down. In crankbaits, we're including diving plugs that feature a high vibration and usually, this is the last half page, by the way, rattling sound chamber. Some popular crankbaits for Yankee bass are the smaller Bagley B, Hotspot, Little N, and the like. In summer months, bass schools do move way up into the backside of even the shallower weeds. When fishing drop-offs and the fish are in this location, crankbaits ripped through the weeds can be the ticket. When using crankbaits, begin retrieving as fast as you can with your rod tip down. Jerk the lure up through the weeds on any resistance you feel. It may signal a strike. Often a hard jerk will free a crankbait from the weeds. When fishing 3 to a boat, it's a good idea for one Bassmaster to use a crankbait while the others fish plastic worms. This can help establish a pattern quickly. The advantage of crankbait allows you to cover a bar rapidly as well as the shallower edges of the weeds. When bass are shallow, they will probably be in an active feeding mood and willing to chase a crankbait and really smash it. Deep diving plugs such as the Deep Jim, Deep Bee, Water Dog, and Mud Bug are effective on bass holding a little deeper. Again, a very fast retrieve is best. Make the lure dig bottom. Use these lures to trigger strikes during extended periods of hot weather. Sluggish acting fish can be taken on these fast-moving lures when a slow-moving bait won't turn them at all. You can get these type build baits deeper without affecting the action by adding a cone-shaped slip sinker onto the line in front of the plug. Cast the deep divers short or parallel to weeds to avoid getting them fouled. Fishing weed lines for bass was one of the first success methods I learned from guiding. It's paid off handsomely for me. It's a simple system, sort of like the ABCs of bass fishing in northern natural lake. First, you must locate the fish. To do that, you must understand the fish itself and how it reacts. Once you know the fish's basic nature, things will become much easier. The final presentation of the lure or bait should become a mechanical exercise. It will improve quickly with plain old experience. Plain old experience. Plain old. OL apostrophe. This is true whether fishing weed lines in the north, timber and brush in mid-America, or moss in the south. That's it. Okay, about the author. Editor's note. Bill Linder, a journalism student at the University of Minnesota in Duluth, is the oldest son of Ron Linder and the nephew of Al Linder, respectively, the publisher and director of The Fisherman. Bill literally cut his eye teeth on the butt of a fishing rod. Since the age of 16, he has been a professional guide during the summer months and has worked many fishing clinics and television shows for his dad and uncle. While attending school, Bill is employed as a part-time researcher for The Fisherman. Since he is a certified scuba diver, much of his work is done underwater, but he also has written a series of radio broadcasts for Al Linder's Outdoors, Inc., and has 5 published magazine articles to his credit. Bill Linder. Miss him. I need to check in on that old Billy boy. Anyways, so that's the end of it. You know, a lot of what he wrote is top-notch information even today. Obviously, some of the techniques and fishing methods are changed, but all that stuff he said about presentation, a lot of it is just spot on, whether it was 1976 or today. And it's fine. I had no idea Bill Linder had an article in this magazine. I just randomly picked this out of my dad's collection, and it was a special treat to find an article written by Bill Linder, who must have been like 18 at the time when this was written. So, and of course, Bill Linder is still actively involved in fishing. He's actively involved in Linder's Angling Edge, as far as I know. I'm pretty sure he is. I don't know, he's a one-of-a-kind guy. I love Bill. I met him when I was in college, worked with him for 9 years, and he didn't change me just as a fisherman. That's just kind of a minor thing. He more or less changed part of who I was as a person for the better. Thanks, Bill. The end.